So welcome TM family to another great webinar of ideas and tools for the health of your church. I'm Kirk Mackie and I'm honored to host this webinar this afternoon. Before we get started though, I do want to just do a shameless plug for our next webinar next Tuesday on November 17th with Glenn Gunderson and Tom Mercer, who will be talking about leadership in uncertain times. We certainly are in those, and these two gentlemen with great ministries and great wisdom will give us a lot of wonderful information. So dial in next week, November 17th, 1 p.m. Pacific. That'll be great. As we begin our webinar today, I just want to introduce our other participants this afternoon. We have Dr. Charles Arnn, who's been a church growth consultant for many years and at least 12 books to his credit. So a very smart individual, and we're really glad to have you here. We also have in the room Apostle Henry Alexander, who ministers here at a church in Southern California, but also has a network of over 1,000 churches worldwide. And this will be powerful for him, and also he will have great insight for us as well. We also have joining us Pastor Ivan Villalta, who's a church planter with a vast network of churches throughout the world in the Spanish-speaking world. So again, gentlemen, we're really excited to have all of you here. And so let's begin. I just want to open up by giving us a little background here. We are thinking about church revitalization today. And across our country, we've noticed that 80 to 85% of churches across all types and stripes and tribes are either plateaued or are actually declining. And so church planting is certainly helping with that. We love to see new churches being planted, but we also know there's lots of existing churches with properties and facilities and ministries and even has connection to the city. Those churches also need to be back in the game and be revitalized. So what we're talking about today is the reality that there actually are 5 life cycles that exist in our churches. And as we understand them, they'll help us to help a church get revitalized again. Now, the idea of an organization's life cycle has been a helpful tool from as far back as in the 1970s. It was actually a very descriptive tool, and it can also be used prescriptively. Now, Dr. Bob Orr from TM here was actually one of the first people to notice that in terms of how it relates to churches, and did some early writing about that in the Growth Report number 4 from the Institute for American Church Growth. And I've known Bob for about 20 years. Bob and I were actually pastoring in neighboring cities, and when I figured out that Bob had been in person with over 3,000 churches in his consulting career, I knew I had to listen closely. And for the last 20 years, I have been doing that, listening closely, and it's a privilege to have Bob share with us. Now, Bob has been doing more research on life cycles and has discovered an additional 4. So today, Bob is going to present how 5 life cycles affect our churches and the implications for revitalization. So Bob, it's good to see you again, brother. Welcome, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Kirk. It's good to be here. The subject today is church revitalization, and the title of the seminar is Life Cycles and Their Interrelationship with One Another. As Kirk had mentioned, the life cycle was actually developed late 1970s, early 1980s. And during that time, we had the data collected from literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of churches where we could see their decadal growth rates and we could see their growth trends over a period of time. And we began to notice that there was a pattern. And when you put on a graph like you're seeing on your screen, that the churches actually had a life cycle. And on one side of the scale, there's the size and the other, the age. And so churches that were 0 to 20 years of age tended to be growing. Churches that were 21 to 40 years tended to be plateaued, and churches more than 40 years tended to be in decline. Now, after we look at that, churches growing in their first 20 years tends to be normal, but churches can have that cycle interrupted and they grow for less than 20 years, and churches that are in that normal zone of 21 to 40, although you would think they'd be plateaued, could actually either be declining or they could be growing. What I noticed in the life cycle is there were some critical points, and I've marked on your diagram there 4 critical points. Critical point A in the life of a church, and that's the slide should come up to you right there. Critical point A in the slide talks about the fact that how you start a church has a lot to do with whether it will be long-term successful or not. For example, we've seen churches that have come out of splits, and they start off in their DNA with a protective, closed off mindset from the start. So be careful about the DNA of your church when you get started. We have a good resource in Transformation Ministries to help with that, and that's called our Discovery Center, and JD Perring can help you with that. Critical point B is when organizations are growing, the tendency is simply to think, if it's working, don't fix it. And what ends up happening, that allows institutionalism to set in. What you really need to be thinking, if it's working, how could we make it work better? How could we make it work differently to see greater fruit? Critical point C is the point where a complacency has started to set in because the church has been on a plateau for an extended period of time. And if that natural aging of the people and the median tenure of the people in the church reaches that critical point C, if changes are not made there, then the church begins to go down on the life cycle. And you enter the downside of the life cycle where the church begins to decline. Critical point D is where a church is entering that stage that Peter Wagner called terminal. It's the point where they neither have the will nor the ability to fight back, and it takes a dramatic intervention at that point for that church to succeed. Now, that was the initial life cycle that I developed and was published in the Winarn Growth Report. My work was added to by a number of others. For example, my good colleague, George Bullard. Early on, I was doing a lot of work with the Southern Baptists out in South Carolina, and George had done some work on the life cycle as well, and he noted that the church life cycle went through 7 different stages. He talked about your organization where you had your initial vision, a vital Christian witness, a witness wins the community confidence. And then he talked about this plateau where there was the fluctuating but sustained average attendance. Then he started talking about the downsides, where the minor adjustments were needed, where the radical change was needed, and where if it wasn't made, the negative happened and the church actually closed. Now, George has done some additional work. In fact, he just did it this year, and I've been involved in some webinars with him. And he's taken that life cycle that he originally developed and that I have worked on, and he's put it in a chart that I think you'll really enjoy. And what he does is he puts it like human life: birth, childhood, adolescence, maturity, retirement, empty nest, and so on. And you'll notice on this diagram, there are little gaps in each step. Why is that? It's because the church goes through very, very specific changes as it grows. And if those changes are not made, that's when the church life cycle is stymied and you start on the way down. He uses 4 criteria and how those 4 criteria shift in the context of keeping the church vital and moving forward. The vision, which is the V, the R, which is the relationships, the P, which is the program, and the M, which is the management. And you'll notice in your diagram, in places the V is high and other places it's low. And what that simply means, at this stage, the vision is very strong. When the V is small, the vision is very weak. And that occurs with all the other issues as well. He also talks about the players involved in revitalization. And the most interesting thing here to notice is that in this process of revitalization, if the pastor's not intimately involved and wants to see the church grow, growth gets sabotaged before you even start. What you also find is that sometimes your people of position are not your most likely candidates to help your church revitalize. What you want is your people of passion, the people who really want to see the church succeed. And you want to find those people who are perhaps on the sidelines right now, but have tremendous potential. That's the nucleus that will move your church forward. And the stakeholders sometimes are your biggest obstacle. As I've been doing church revitalization as a transitional pastor, that's what I found. The people that you have the most problems with moving the church forward are the people who are the long-term stakeholders in the church. So in George Bullard's observation, each stage is 4 to 7 years, and there needs to be a time to stop and evaluate what you're doing and make the changes to move to the next level. He uses the concept of having a sabbatical, that every 5 or 6 years, when you realize that you've put this part in place, stop, evaluate, then move on. And that will help your church reach that state of thriving. Now, remember as well that the farther down the life cycle you go, the more dramatic the prescription has to be. Once you move out of the potentially thriving stage, and that means you're willing to make the changes, if you move to the final stage, the options for revitalization are limited. Now, the next diagram that you're looking at is from the Unstuck group. In this section of the presentation, we're talking about how the life cycle has been expanded. Tony Morgan from the Unstuck group has taken the initial life cycle that we did, and what he has done is he's again put it into 7 steps. And his strategy is to assess your health, clarify your vision, and look at your structure. Now, the Unstuck resources are available through the church health department at TM. And if you're interested in going through the video courses he has, you're more than welcome to do so. And it really doesn't cost you anything to do it. We have a link, and we actually have personnel who will help guide you through the study. So some final conclusions about this life cycle. It is natural, but not inevitable. You can accelerate it. It's interruptible, it's understandable, it's repeatable, and that's the way the life cycle works. Not inevitable. You can keep a church growing, and we've got lots of examples of that. Now, this is where my friend Chip may be very instrumental in helping me with this area. What did we do with what we knew? We're sitting around the office in church growth back in the early 1980s, and we're saying, okay, 80 to 85% of churches are plateaued or declined. What do we do about it? Well, we actually had a couple of approaches that were taken. The first was using strategic intervention as a catalyst to shock the church back. I had an experience where my heart went out of rhythm, and what they wanted to do is shock me to get it back into rhythm. And that's what happens. You need to have some kind of catalyst. Sometimes it's a change of pastors. Sometimes it's a crisis that comes, that you manage the crisis. The Chinese word for crisis is opportunity. So you manage the crisis, planting a new church within the existing church, closing and then reopening the church. Morro Bay, for example, is a good example of that in our movement. The renewal of the pastor, a strategic merger, renewal of the laity, denominational intervention. Church of the Lighted Cross in Morongo Valley is a current example of that in TM, where the church had gone down to about 5 people, and Mark Lambert and myself went in and did an intervention, and that church today is healthy and is one of the leaders in baptisms in our movement. An outside consultant can come in if you're willing to listen to them. I think they can really help you. And relocation of the church. Lyle Schaller commented that 5% of churches won't grow unless they move. And my friend Chip has noted that many times when you're stuck, begin anew in a different service. And he has written a book on that subject, how to add an additional worship service, which is very, very helpful and has been used as a guide for many churches. The second approach was rebirthing the organization using various health systems. For example, assimilation, infrastructure, lay development, outreach, worship, finance, governance, and on the list goes. But the first approach, intervene. The second approach, take the existing systems in the church and look at them in light of the missional objective and say, are they helping or are they hurting? And that was the approach that was done. And Chip and myself and his dad developed a 2-year plan to do that intentionally with churches. Stay with them in process, look at their assimilation, look at their outreach, look at their lay development. And it worked. It worked partly because we looked at the resources and partly because we gave them the resources to really help them do that. Well, anyway, after we had done this, I began to make some observations. Culture began to shift. I note that the cycle has shortened. In most churches that are started in the last 15 years, the cycle, the peak of their cycle tends to happen in 6 to 12 years rather than 20. That has shortened. If any of the 5 life cycles I'll mention very quickly get stuck, the organization gets stuck. Okay, if any of them get stuck, they're interrelated and interdependent. I would also suggest to you that when you're revitalizing a church, one size doesn't fit all. Bill Mackie, who is the head of the evangelism department for the Southern Baptists, made the observation that the canned approaches that we get for our churches only work for about 10% of the churches that try them. So every church is unique. You have to understand that and particularize the kind of help that they need in their application.
Are you open to questions at this point?
Yes.
I would ask, if I may. Just on that, thank you so much. On that one issue that you raised about cultural differences and how they play into this. To what extent do you see things the same, or obviously our cultures are very different, and the African-American church culture is very significantly different. Typically, it's very much, all right, thanks so much. Typically, it's very much dominated by the founding pastor and so forth, and independent of real accountability and that sort of thing. So do you find the same kinds of dynamics in African-American churches? And you mentioned Ivan and the Latino churches that are coming along, and how they tend to be smaller and younger. So what are the cultural differences? So what are the cultural differences? Are they significant?
Well,
are they significant?
I'm going to give you something that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the workshop that I'll address. But basically, whether you're a Hispanic pastor or a Black pastor or an Anglo pastor, basically, if you as a leader get stuck, the church is stuck, regardless of culture.
Sure.
That's very important to understand. When you as a leader are stuck, these 5 cycles are interrelated and intertwined. So if the leader gets stuck, it means the organization is stuck. And that's why in the intervention strategies, we talked about a new pastor or a renewal of the pastor as being one of the essential strategies. And that we have known, well, how long do you think we've known that, Chip? Maybe 30, 40 years? At least, yeah.
Bob? A good question. I'd like to kind of hitchhike on the question of cultural adaptability of life cycles. The more I learned about life cycles, the more I realized that it is not unique to a church. actually all living things have life cycles. Plants have life cycles, trees, human beings, churches have life cycles. Even organizations that are not religious in nature have life cycles. So for whatever reason, it seems that the life cycle phenomena of a living organism applies to anything that's alive.
Sure.
It has growth, it has plateau, and it has decline. So it's a good question, but in this case, I think it's a universal phenomena applied to living things.
One of the things that we looked at in this is you needed to have process and you needed to have resources. Those were two things that were necessary. And Wynn and Chip and myself produced something called a growth development scale, and that scale is up on your screen now. And what it says is that when you get a church on the downside of the life cycle, there's generally a fairly high degree of ignorance about what the real mission of the church is. The values of evangelism are not really present. Some information starts to come in, and as the information comes in, there tends to be some discontent with the status quo that starts to emerge, and new ideas start getting infused. People's lives began to change, and then the organization changed. And this is a principle we've learned, is people have to change before the organization. If you're a pastor and you're trying to change your church, but you haven't changed the hearts of your people, you're going to get stuck, because you need to have people change, organizations change. Then what happens is not everything you do works. Hold on to change lightly, because if it's not working, you'll be glad to let it go, and so will they. And then as you get effective, and we've got a number of effective churches where the missional effectiveness has been well integrated, and innovation is a characteristic of the church. Now, the one thing we knew is that when you start with a church on the downside of the life cycle, it normally takes 12 to 36 months to turn it around. We had set the time frame as somewhere around 24 months, and the majority of churches in 24 months were helped. There were some churches that were so bad it took a little longer, or else we were bad as consultants. Well, now what I want to do is, now that we've left the basic life cycle, I want to talk about what other cycles there are and how this whole issue became interrelated. In 1988, a man by the name of Robert Dale, he had taken a look at the life cycle and said the most common routes that were being used were reorganization. And we had been doing that, and he observed that the key that he noticed is that beyond all of it, you had to rethink your purpose and develop a new dream. And what he did is he developed the life cycle of the dream. And here you see it, where you have a dream that starts the church going. It goes to beliefs. Then the goals come. Then the structure comes. Then the ministry. Then nostalgia. Then questioning. Then polarization. Then dropout. Michelle, can you just move to the next step? There. Now, what happens in churches, as you go down, as the dream begins to die, what you do is have a natural tendency to just want to put a Band-Aid on it, fix the structure. If we could put 3 more people on the board, if we could add this committee, if we could do this structural stuff, but it never works. Because if you're on the downside of the life cycle on the dream, if there is no dream, there's nothing that will compel the pilgrimage. Okay? Without the vision, the people perish. And so the key to every church on the downside of the life cycle is find a way to develop a new vision that will compel the pilgrimage.
So can I ask, this time, we know that we know that essence of the church is to make followers of Jesus Christ, to disciple people into the likeness of Jesus Christ. That never changes, obviously. So when you talk about the dream that has to be renewed, that means specific achievements in particular areas that are maybe unique to that church.
Yeah. The dream has two characteristics that I would give to it that I think are helpful.
Okay.
Number one, the dream has to be redemptive in nature.
Okay.
It has to focus, the dream has to focus out of the purpose of God for his church.
Right.
The second thing is that dream has to be visible. We have to know what it would look like if we achieved it.
All right.
Okay.
Got
So
it.
the dream, when I'll give you one example, when Bob Schuler created the Crystal
Correct.
Cathedral, he
Right.
created a dream.
Correct.
Okay. The mistake they did is they had the dream being a building, but not the dream being a mission. And eventually, after they got the building, the church started to trickle down, in spite of the fact that that dream was complete. It was seeable, but it was not missional.
Yeah.
So those two characteristics have to be in place.
Yeah, and if I may, that's exactly what I was trying to clarify, because we know what the big picture objective is, but the specific thing that we do toward that big picture objective is the dream that you're referring to that has to be renewed at a given point in the process.
Correct.
So people are inspired by that particular set of activities or objectives. Okay.
So what I do when I'm with a church is I say, if your church was to live up to God's expectations, what would it look like in 3 years? And that helps clarify the dream. As we are going quickly on time, what happened to bump the understanding to the next level? Let's continue. Joel Barker wrote some material on the business of discovering the future in 1993. And he talked about paradigms as a way to help us understand our past. Paradigms are what set the boundaries for the things we do and don't do. He introduced a film on that subject, and we used it in many churches. So paradigms are about the way of doing things right. If you've ever heard a church say, this is the way we do things around here, what they're doing is describing their paradigm. Okay? That is a very important understanding. So we look at this cycle here on paradigms, and you'll notice that it's more like an S curve, but it can become a bell curve if you're not careful. You have A, B, and C. A is the time when the paradigm you're using currently is not working as well as it used to. You'll notice that this cycle starts slow. It doesn't seem to be accelerating. It's that low, slow part because it's answering some of the questions that need to be answered, but the real emerging questions are not being answered. B is when the new paradigm is beginning to work. C is where the B paradigm is not working as well as it used to either. So it starts to go, and if you don't make changes up there, then you find a crisis begins to set in, and the church dies because of a lack of vision. That's the life cycle. So the best time to introduce a new paradigm is in the middle to late period of the old paradigm. Now, one of the things we do in consultation, and Chip has done this and I have done this, we begin to look at every single ministry the church has, and we ask them, is what you're doing working? I had a consultation with a church just about a month ago, and we got talking about this issue of paradigms, and I said very simply, you are answering one question very well. And the question you're answering very well is, how do we help people over the age of 70 be cared for? But I said, you're not even asking the question of how do we reach people under the age of 30? So your community, the median age is 30, and you're answering a question that doesn't even affect the people that are in your community. So paradigms answer questions.
So Bob, I'm going to jump in there for a second.
Ideally, the paradigm is an S curve,
So, hey, Bob.
and because it's an S curve, if you don't have relevant paradigms, the church becomes irrelevant.
Hey, Bob, I want to jump in on something there. As you talked about that paradigm curve, Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so on that paradigm curve, I mean, you're basically saying that if while it's still working, we should already be thinking about taking apart a good ministry so that it doesn't become stale, which is counterintuitive to most pastors, because if it's working, we just keep it going. But then you're saying if we keep it too long, it gets really stuck and stale and takes us over the edge. Is that fair?
That is a fair statement. We have the philosophy, if it's working, don't fix it. And the philosophy that growing churches have, if it's working, how could we do it differently and better? Or how could we take what we're doing and make it more effective? They're constantly asking that pushing question of excellence.
And Bob, the other day, you and I were talking about this, and I think you said it earlier in this presentation that, it's something like every 4 to 7 years, we should be evaluating that. Even if it's working, you're saying it's probably about to come to its end. And we should start. So if we got a really good small group system and the way we're doing it, for example, at the same time, if it's 4 or 5 years into it, we should probably be thinking about the next way to do it instead of just holding on to it.
Could I toss in a thought too?
Please do.
One of the things we have been talking about are life cycles in churches, as if there's one church and the life cycle is applied to that church. That's a good macro view of the process, but it's also helpful to realize that every ministry, every small group, every activity in the church has its own life cycle, and that not every small group or ministry will be at the same point in their own life cycle. A life cycle may have been started, or say a new ministry started years ago by Sister Gertrude, and that was near and dear to her passion. It was going on for 40 years. In reality, if you were to trace the attendance of Sister Gertrude's ministry, it would probably be on the backside of the life cycle. So I think pastors are well suited to understand this life cycle process, not only applying to the local church, but to individual groups. And one of the best ways to introduce Sister Gertrude to the possibility of closing down or shutting down or starting up a new ministry would be to explain to her the life cycle and the fact that it's not an indictment on her leadership or the passion of the people. It's just a phenomena that that happens. It's like gravity. You can't do anything about gravity. You can't do anything about life cycles, except if you're aware of them, then you can harness them for good. So life cycles can be a real ally to church leaders in explaining and introducing the possibility for change. That's not the fault of the leader. It's just a phenomenon of the process.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Chip. By the way, just an observation, and I have this on the notes. Lyle Schaller observed that churches, because many of the old paradigms are sacred cows, it is best in revitalization to use a both and approach, not an either or approach. In other words, when you're doing things, you tend to get more resistance when you take those sacred cows and try to make hamburger out of them. All right. Lyle Schaller has written on that, and it's called The 10 Steps to Move Your Church Off a Plateau.
Can I ask a question? I don't want to misdirect what we're doing.
But is it okay if I pose one question? And I hope this doesn't throw you off. The truths that you're giving us are timeless and they're solid, and they cover wide spans of time and wide groups of people. But is there anything specific to this moment? And I'm talking about this whole pandemic, COVID, crazy thing. Is there anything that you're freshly observing in this new season that we're in now? Because every church that I know is dramatically different than it was 12 months ago. And so how do these cycles and these kinds of seasons of a church, how are they impacted by what's going on now? What are intelligent responses to make to this unique moment? How does this apply to this crisis? Or have you thought those things through?
In this crisis, all of us are learners, but one of the things that I'm observing in talking to pastors is when they went online, when they first went online, their viewership was huge. And then it started to taper off, and now it's almost nothing.
I see.
And so it's had a life cycle.
Yeah.
So you have to say, how could we communicate to people better? Because this is obviously not working. So I
That's good.
think the new way of doing things in this new COVID environment are probably different.
Yeah.
And I've just agreed to serve on a group out of the Great Commission Research Network being headed by one of the guys out at Azusa Pacific, that we're going to be doing a research among churches on the impact of the COVID and the churches that are succeeding during it, the churches that are failing during it, and what are the ones doing differently. And there's a study actually underway on that. So I think you'll find it helpful. I put this quote up because I think it's helpful. The gap between the church and the churchless continues to grow. And it appears that Christian communities of faith will struggle more than they ever to engage church outsiders in their neighborhoods, towns, or cities. Now, here's the question: how are vision and values related? Values are a soil into which the seed of vision gets planted. Vision without values doesn't have the convictional base to enable movement. It's like casting pearls before the swine. When your missional vision and your values are in harmony, that is when you see evangelistic results. Now remember, vision is what gives our values behavioral direction. Okay? And beliefs become values when you attach behavior. So for example, if you say I value generosity, I could look at your checkbook and know if you really mean that or not. If you say I love lost people, I could look and ask you the question, when was the last time you had coffee with an unreached person? When was the last time you prayed for them? In other words, to believe something is not a value. A value is when you take a belief and make it real in your behavior. I did a study among the Southern Baptists and did a study on values, and we found out that declining churches on the downside of the life cycle and growing churches on the upside of the life cycle believed the same thing. The difference was churches that were growing took what they believed and made it work. The others just kept it as standard belief. Now, here's a life cycle on beliefs, on values. You need to have deeply held beliefs. But remember, it doesn't become a value until behavior is attached. Now what you do, a belief has to have defined behavior. So you define the behavior, then the values are practiced. The why and what are together, and the growth is normal. Then action becomes sporadic on the value, and people begin to question, why are we doing what we're doing? And the value starts to be lost, and down there, it is forgotten. I preached a message once called The Stigma of the Empty Baptistry. That what happens is we're enjoying church, but nobody's being saved. Nobody's coming to know Christ. And we're content with, as McGavran said, we're content with being in the harvest field, but not bringing any sheaves into the master's house. So very little missional revitalization occurs without evangelistic value shifting. Now let's take this concept about values as their relationship to life cycle. Let's say you've got church A on the downside of the life cycle, and you have church B or in that church A, the life cycle of the values is on the downside. So what you notice is that these lines are intercrossing. You may be growing, but you may not be growing out of evangelistic fruit. You may be growing out of transfer. And I want to say something carefully, but I want to say it strongly. Unless you have evangelistic values driving revitalization, you may get the euphoria of success by seeing more people come, but basically you're shuffling Christians from one church to another. Unless you build evangelistic values, and I've observed that as I've actually gone into churches that have been involved in revitalization, and when I ask the tough question of the new people that have come to your church in the past 3 years or 2 years, whatever the process was, how many of them came as first-time decisions? The church is growing, but they can't name one that came from an unchurched background. So the values become very important.
So Bob, I want to jump in there. I've got a question here that came from our participants. I think it relates to what you just said. The question was, if there's a bigger gap between the church and the unchurched, then what does a new life cycle need to include in order to effectively reach the unchurched?
Is that a question to the whole panel or to me, Kirk?
That was just thrown out to you and the panel. Anybody can grab onto it.
My experience is very simple. If I see that the missional values are on the downside of the life cycle, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the dream has missional value. I want to look at the paradigms and find out if they have a relevance. And I also want to come back to these values and find out what is actually happening. I have actually designed a value test that you can test people and find out how many of the key evangelistic values they actually hold. And I just don't think that unless people in the congregation believe that lost people matter to God and matter to me, and if the pastors don't believe that lost people matter to God and matter to them, I found out as a pastor, the best way to get the church turned around is for me to be able to tell the stories of the people that are unchurched that I'm relating to. Because people in the church, I like what John Wimber says, people in the church are not willfully disobedient to what you teach. They're faithfully obedient to the example you set.
Charles Arn, what would you say to that?
Comment. Thank you. I'd like to
ask, could you please, Dr. Orr, amplify on exactly what George Varner was saying about the distance between the unchurched and the church? I mean, I think we have a general sense of what he was saying, but could you be more specific about that and how you see it? I think that would be helpful.
I would say that the best person to answer that question is probably Kirk. His whole life's ministry is based on helping churches bridge that gap between their community and their church. So Kirk, do you want to comment on that?
Well, it's kind of like what we were just talking about that you said earlier. We have to have a personal renewal before you change any of the structures. What I do in my missional pathways, we actually help churches come to grips at an individual level with, how reimagining and understanding and connecting with their own salvation again. What God has done is an identity to call us out from sin into grace and into a new world. And then what it means to be those kind of agents in our world. And so we do it at the individual level, and then we begin to take that outward into larger ministry. So it's a renewal process I think has to happen, a lot along the way.
I have been in a number of church revitalization projects, and in each case, I've asked Kirk to come in and take the people through that process, because as I wanted to renew the values of evangelism, helping people deal with the junk in their trunk was an essential part of really getting transformation, getting people who not only love Jesus, but love lost people. I've asked people in a church this question that I think is very, very telling. I said, can you point to a time in your life when you were more in love with Jesus than you are today? Because you're going through a spiritual life cycle as well.
Charles, Ron, do you have a
Now,
comment
here's
there? I
some
think you
things
tried
I've
to come in.
learned that
Hang on,
shift
Bob,
the
just a second.
values of an organization. Number one, you have to be convicted about the truth. So one of the things that I do is I preach what is true that we need to be holding on to and acting on. We need to develop behaviors to tell people, if you really believe this, this is what you can do. We need to set the example as a leader, and we need to practice the behavior until it becomes natural. That's what I call the hallelujah side of duty. I didn't learn to love giving until I gave. When I first gave, I said, why do I need to do that? I needed to get to enjoy the process. It became part of me to become generous. And now I say, generous people not only have the happiest lives, generosity is what changes the world. And I think you ought to celebrate what happens, lift the value high. One of the ways that I did this as a pastor, when I went into the baptistry to baptize people, I brought not simply the minister into the baptistry, but I brought the person into the baptistry who brought them to Christ and the church in. Because what I was doing to the congregation was saying to everybody, you can do it too. And it was lifting the value high. How do you get your values? They're chosen freely, without coercion. The alternatives can be defined and known. They're acted on, and they need to get integrated into your own life so there's a cohesion of who you are. Now, here's one additional life cycle. This is the fifth one we'll look at, and probably the last one we'll talk about today. Much has been written by people like Bobby Clinton. My observation, this is just an observation, it's anecdotal, but it's true enough to be almost like a law. Most of the pastors who've been in their churches more than 15 to 18 to 20 years are in churches that are on the downside of the life cycle. Very few are the long-term pastors who keep the church growing. I've been doing a study interviewing pastors who've been in their church for 20 years, and their churches continue to grow by 5% or more a year, and at least 40% of that growth is first-time conversions. And I'm finding that those pastors are doing something to stop the life cycle of the leader from going down. And that is one of the things that we're learning. If you're stuck as a leader, your church is stuck. And so we have a study on a leadership life cycle. 3 comments from 3 key leaders. Pete Wagner contended that if the leader is the most important factor in the growth. John Maxwell noted that leaders are the lid. Peter Drucker said that the leader is what caps the capacity of the organization. I think it was Kirk that said more failures arise because of a failure in character than it does in competence. And so sometimes when we're doing consulting, we say, this church is not going to change until the leader changes. We just know you can't do anything at this point. And most leaders don't start out as incompetent and ineffective. The life cycle catches them over a period of time as a leader. Let me show you this, and we'll put this cycle up here. The leadership life cycle goes something like this: a clear call, a desire to do something significant, a vision that grows out of that call that compels action, and values that I develop that are compatible with that call and vision. I work it out. Goals are clear, initial fruit is being seen, the pastor, the leader is setting the example. After you do something for a while, don't get weary in well-doing. You've heard the scriptures say that. Struggles and fatigue, spiritual disciplines fade, ministry becomes less fun, and courage is starting to fade. That's the first stage at which a leader gets stuck. They've lost their courage, ministry's not fun, the spiritual disciplines are not there, struggles and fatigue. Then you recognize that you do what you do because that's what you do. And a routine comes into play without much fruit or fun. Boredom sets in and institutional resistance starts to build, so you and the institution begin to get content. That's your second stage. When you as a leader lack personal growth, when you have siloed, when the joy is gone, and where retreading the old is common, you're in the third stage of stuck. And then the final stage, both you and the church are stuck. You resist change. Hope seems to have left the station and you're coasting to the finish line. I remember talking to a pastor a few years ago in one of our churches, and he said, look, I'm 4 years away from retirement. Don't rock the boat and do anything to ruin that. Okay, that was actually said in a consultation. Come on, guys.
Why did he call you?
Huh?
How did he call you if that's what he wanted?
Well, I just happened to be in,
In the neighborhood.
no, I happened to be doing a consultation with the church because the assumption was if a consultant can come in and help my church but not affect me, I'm in great shape. And that happened. When I meet with pastors, and if any of you have met with me, you know I've asked these questions. I ask these questions. When was the last time you did something for the first time and it made a difference? Second question, what are the top 3 lessons you've learned about your leadership in the past year that you've made part of your practice? Are you more in love with Jesus and his mission today than you've been at any previous point of time in your life? Is the fire still there? When was the last time you got excited about something new and different that got you moving in a new and different direction? When was the last time you actually led someone to Christ? If asked about a clear vision for your church and its ministry, would you be able to articulate it clearly? Would you say you're coasting or climbing? And if you continue to do what you're doing in the way you're doing it, will you hear well done? Well, those are just some of the questions that I think if your leader is stuck, if you ask those questions, you'll find out. Now, what I want to do now is I want to just step back for a moment and let Kirk move into the teaching component because he's developed a leadership circle or a leadership grid, and I think you'll find it very, very helpful for that. So Kirk, let me turn it over to you and then I'll come back and wrap it up.
So thank you, Bob. So I want to make the comment that as I looked at your cycle for leadership, I realized I was actually stuck at the second stage. I had been at my church on Wilshire Avenue for 18 and a half years. And somebody actually challenged me and said, I think you're bored. And it was offensive, and yet it was true. And I had to own that and realize that God was actually preparing me for something else. So you can see it again here on the screen. The routine without much fruit or fun, boredom had set in. There was some resistance starting to build, and nobody could quite figure out what the problem was, but the problem was me. I was just sort of done with what I think I was called to do, and I was ready for something else, but didn't know where to go. And then God, serendipitously, I've met a man from a different mission organizations, and the next thing I know, I'm in a new ministry, a new leadership, and a whole new life cycle, and I'm having a lot of fun. So it's a real deal, and I'm excited for the new pastor that's come to take Wilshire to the next place. So it's really good. Let me just say something about that, what you called, or I'm calling the Mackie Matrix. Michelle, if you put that up there on the screen again. Since I've actually stepped away from my ministry as a TM pastor and now working amongst pastors around the country and around the world, I just came up with this matrix. And if you want to fill in the blanks there real quick, each one will pop up. The idea is everything above the middle line is in the supernatural realm, and then everything below the middle line is in the natural realm. The left side of the line is in the order and process world. It's just if you learn these things and pull these levers, things will begin to happen. On the right side of the matrix, it's relational kinds of stuff. And I've realized that all four of these areas we need to be growing in constantly. And so I even began my leadership journey at Wilshire in the leadership task area, just learning skills and learning how to lead better, and reading books and pulling levers and going to seminars and learning how to do the tasks. And then God says, yeah, that's good. And yet you also got to pay attention to your soul. And I had to start looking at my strengths and my weaknesses, my family of origin, the stuff that I bring to the table, my strengths finder, my Enneagram, all these kinds of things that help me understand how I relate to people and to God. And then God pushed me up above and realized, am I getting my marching orders from Jesus, or am I just leading out of my own skill set and out of my own visions? And so God's been deepening my walk with him on the personal level, spiritual disciplines and things like that. And then I began to move over and realize that there's a whole spiritual power and authority dimension, this whole area of how does the spiritual universe work, and how do I interface with that, and how does the angelic and the demonic and the Holy Spirit really work, and how does that affect our churches, and how does it affect leadership? And so I'm actually working and researching all four of these and writing a book on this. So thanks for the plug. It's hopefully out in a year or so. But these are the things I'm paying attention to as I coach pastors. And I realize we can get stuck, or we're not growing in any one of these quadrants, and that can really get us and can also hold the church back. So thanks for letting me share that.
Do you want to comment on the 5 questions that follow that, Kirk?
Actually, at this point, I'd love just to hear from Dr. Arnn or Bishop Alexander or Pastor Villalta, just anything we've heard as we're coming down to the end of our time. Is there anything that you've heard in the last few slides, or that you just want to raise a question or a comment? Please feel free to throw that in there.
Might be a good spot, Michelle, to put the poll question up.
You can do a poll as well, sure.
While Michelle's putting the poll up, just a quick thought on life cycles. As we've already talked about, life cycles are like gravity, they just happen. There's growth, there's plateau, decline. So the secret for any church leader of any focus, group, church, district, region, the secret is not to break that natural life cycle. You can't do anything about gravity, but it's really to begin a new life cycle. So the process of church growth or congregational growth is not so much doing harder and longer what we have been doing that got us here. It's to begin a new life cycle. And if you'd like a simple rule, at least I've found it simple in my life and experience, is the secret to beginning a new life cycle is beginning something new. Or the formula would be new units equals new growth. A unit could be anything. It could be a church, it could be a worship service, it could be a small group. But new units equal new growth. When you begin something new, you're beginning a new life cycle. Doesn't mean every life cycle is started off new will flourish, but I can guarantee you, and we've seen already, that the churches on the backside of the life cycle will not flourish unless they begin a new life cycle. That's why I did the book, How to Start a New Service. It wasn't to change the old service, it was to add a new service. And so new units equal new growth. A good secret to starting new life cycles.
Question that is relevant for me. Can I be heard? I think I can. All right. Is there in the culture, we've talked a lot about what happens from our side. I'm interested in what's happening from the cultural side, the people in the world that we're attempting to reach. Is there, and well, 2 things come to mind. One of them is, and I'm speaking as a man who's above 70, clearly so. Is there such a bias against certain pastors at a certain age that those pastors become a hindrance to what could happen in the church otherwise, apart from other issues, just, age as its own, not state of mind, not an old paradigm, not an old vision, but just simply biological age? To what extent is that a factor in limiting what a church is able to do? And that's it as a man who's going to be 73 in a month or so. And probably should have retired 15 years ago. But I'd like to know what the truths of that are from your perspective.
Let me make a comment on that I think might be helpful. Let me make a comment on that. I'll talk about a person who is getting close to your age and mine, who is still very vital. The church is still kicking butt, and that's just down the street from us, Pastor Glenn Gunderson. You can go to people like Tom Mercer. You can go to some examples outside of our movement, and you can go to people like John MacArthur, or you can go to people like down near the San Diego area. And you can see lots of older leaders who are very, very effective and are able to reach young people. So I think it has more to do with what's your vision? What paradigms are you willing to allow to shift? And I think change can be made. I used to say as a pastor, when I saw an older church, I said, I need the people that are doing worship to worship in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable. Because I realized that if the paradigms that were being put in place were only comfortable to me, then at that point, I was getting the church stuck in that old paradigm. So
I'm glad to hear that age in and of itself isn't, it doesn't eliminate dynamic ministry activity.
So gentlemen, as we come up on the end of the hour here, Bob, is there a couple slides that summarize some of the 5 life cycles we can take a look at quickly?
Yep. Yes, indeed. The church's true, authentic organizing principle is mission. When the church is on mission, it's the true church. I'm going to go over this very quickly, and I'm going to go down to they work together. You're down about 3 slides, Michelle, if you can. I'm going to skip over some things. There we go. I have put on this diagram the 5 cycles. Each of those 5 cycles works independently. You can look at the organizational cycle and you can say, am I on the downside of that organizational cycle? Am I institutionalized? Have I drifted? You can go to the other 4 and you can start to be prescriptive. You can say, what is the dream? If there's no dream, that's one of the things that will keep you on the downside. You can look at your paradigms. Is what you're doing working? If it isn't, that's one of the things that'll put you on the downside. As you as a leader, are you a vital, growing leader? If that's on the downside, the organization gets stuck. So what we observe is these cycles interplay. When one gets stuck, they all get stuck. Does that
make sense? Sure.
So what happens here, when you get your organizational structure, your programs, your management, and all of that working, when you got the dream, the paradigm, the values, and the leadership all working at one level, that's when you reach that stage that George Bullard calls thriving. Your church is actually moving forward in terms of its mission. So hopefully that is helpful.
Excellent.
I want to make a quote, and I think we'll probably close the session with this quote. If we lose a generation of young people, millennials, Gen Z to the church, it won't be because we didn't entertain them. It will be because we didn't dare them to do something meaningful with the gospel in light of the world we live in. I would also close by simply saying, if we put up that poll question that has to do with, if you take a look at your church, which of the life cycles do you need the most help in? And if you will call the church, the TM office, somebody from the chat team who has expertise to help you move forward in those areas will certainly be able to help you. So if you need help, we need the leadership when on there. It's not there, but that's okay.
Well, so Bob, so I'll say
Organization,
thank
dream,
you.
paradigm, values. Oh, the leadership should have been separate, but that's okay.
So Bob, thank you for sharing your latest research.
All
with
right,
us.
I'm going to turn it back to Kirk Mackie and let Kirk wrap up. And I think we're at the hour.
We are at the hour. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your latest research. To Charles Arnn, Bishop Alexander, Ivan Villalta, it's just great to have you with us. Thank you to the participants that were here today. Bob's presentation, which has about 77 slides, we only went through a handful of them, will be made available on the TM website. So that will be for you. And thank you for allowing us to kind of get into your heart and mind, Bob. Thank you for all the work you have done, and to all the gentlemen here on the panel. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you to Michelle behind the scenes. We bless you and thank you. Continue to pray for the health of the churches of Transformation Ministries. We'll see you next time. Thank you.